Hi, I'm Julia Hamm, President and CEO of the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Welcome to this general session, and thanks for attending our digital Smart Energy Week program. I find it hard to believe that 2 years have passed since we were last together in 2019 in Salt Lake City. During this time, the clean energy industry has been hard at work and much has changed. We have a new administration in Washington, D.C., one that has prioritized efforts to combat climate change. And on many fronts, carbon reduction progress is accelerating. Electric utility commitments, for example, to carbon reduction continue the recent wave of momentum, with 72% of US customer accounts being served by a utility with a commitment to get to 100% carbon free. You can keep abreast of these commitments through SEPA's carbon reduction tracker on our website. As we outlined in our utility transformation profile released earlier this year, progress is being made across many dimensions, but yet much work still remains. Clean energy technologies continue to improve in efficiency and cost, and new efforts by the federal government offer hope for increasing the pace and diversity of deployment. But at the same time, severe weather events continue to increase in frequency and intensity, as demonstrated by Hurricane Ida, which caused destruction in New Orleans and the Gulf region and throughout the Northeast. And governments worldwide are lacking in the commitments to carbon reduction needed to meet the Paris Agreement targets. So while our industry has much to celebrate, we also feel increased urgency to accelerate the rate of progress. SEPA's work is focused on delivering this accelerated progress. Across electrification, regulatory and business innovation, and grid integration, our programs are bringing key industry players together to find solutions to common challenges and to develop innovative roadmaps to a carbon-free future. We've entered the most important and challenging phase of the transformation to a carbon-free energy system, realization of the vision and goals. This is where carbon reduction gets real. During this session, I speak with New Orleans Mayor Cantrell about the urgency to act now on climate change, the progress New Orleans has achieved in recent years, and the action still needed to reach the city's carbon-free goal. I'm also joined by Alice Jackson from Xcel Energy Colorado and Rayford Smith from X, Google's electric grid moonshot company, to hear how their organizations are tackling carbon reduction challenges. Let's get to it. Mayor Cantrell, it's been a difficult past year and a half for all of us, but you and those of New Orleans in particular. Everyone in the clean energy community is so disappointed that we cannot be there in New Orleans in person for this event, enjoying the amazing city of New Orleans and bringing a much needed boost to the local economy. But of course, unfortunately, Hurricane Ida has prevented that from happening. How's the recovery from the hurricane going, and how are the people of New Orleans doing today?
Right. So, first of all, definitely wish you were here as well. But there will be other opportunities, I promise, and better conditions. I know that we're looking forward to them. As it relates to Hurricane Ida, which was a Category 4 hurricane that was over the city for about 12 hours, 16 years after Hurricane Katrina devastated the city. One of the things in the post-Hurricane Ida footprint on the ground was that there was not that same level of devastation. We saw that our levees held the line. We saw that our sewage and water board utility held the line. We did not have to rescue folks nor lose people in terms of loss of life. And so I would say we saw that our investments in our levees and infrastructure protected the city from flooding, and at the same time, though, with the entire city losing power, we really also saw that our electric grid is in need of much, much investment. Our power infrastructure should definitely include a mix of regional transmission, planning, and local generation in terms of operations. That's what we saw and learned firsthand. And we must include, and I know you would appreciate this, renewable energy in the planning so that New Orleans truly can be more resilient and sustainable. But when I think about where we were 16 years ago, we're nowhere where we were before. So that's a good thing.
That's great news to hear the progress that's been made. And I definitely want to come back to that issue of the electric grid and dive in a little deeper on that in just a few minutes. But you mentioned Hurricane Katrina 16 years ago. And, my understanding is that actually it was Hurricane Katrina and the green dot map were what propelled you into civic service. Tell us about that.
Well, I was involved in my community actually pre-Katrina. I was the president of my neighborhood organization. So community organizer, at heart. And after Hurricane Katrina, absolutely pushed me even further into community activism, especially when my neighborhood of Broadmoor was recommended to the mayor at the time that it not return, that it become a drainage park, that it become a green dot. And so we woke up, my neighbors and I woke up right after Katrina, of course, having evacuated, with seeing on the front page of our local newspaper a big green dot over our neighborhood. One that we had no involvement in, no discussions and the like, but the Bring Back New Orleans Commission that was formed by the mayor pretty much aligned itself with that particular plan. So I was quoted as saying all hell broke loose, when we saw that green dot, and absolutely moved swiftly into activation, proclaiming that Broadmoor would live and that we would not become a drainage park, but we would adapt ourselves to mitigating flooding, embracing green infrastructure, and that's what we did. So, while this plan did not have, its faults, it was still a huge achievement for the city because it was the first time New Orleans had a predictable land use plan built on citizen engagement. And that's the plan that was drafted by the residents of Broadmoor and has now, when I look back from there to now, over 98% of what was in our plan has been fully implemented.
Wow, that is such a great story and so heartwarming to hear that the community engagement aspect really came through and was a focus and true and really proved how important that is in terms of actually adapting, as you said, and as you talked about earlier, the fact that Hurricane Ida was really proved that all of those efforts that the community had identified as being important actually worked. So
that's exactly right. I always say the world's greatest experts on where they live are the residents themselves. But I also have to say, listen, 16 years ago and understanding the impacts and the organizing on the ground during Katrina, and then not having faced another Katrina, I do kind of sense some folks have kind of forgotten about how far we've come as a city, as a community, because the number one issue right now our folks are talking about is trash, solid waste collection, not even the thought of how far we've come as a city making progress. So I just want to remind folks, sometimes we can have short memories, but I'm telling you, the people who were in the trenches, we never forget. Mm-hmm. And it really did move this city forward in a way that we can realize the progress on today.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, so in New Orleans, you sit in this convergence of forces, right? You're surrounded by the fossil fuel industry and you're feeling the brunt of climate change in a way that, well, unfortunately, so many cities these days are, but New Orleans certainly is right up there at the top of the list. In 2019, you announced that New Orleans was suing some oil and gas companies. Tell me about that. What prompted that move? How does that reflect on the city's perspectives and views about climate change?
Right. So one, this city has embraced the fact that we're losing a football field a day. We have embraced the fact that we are on the front lines of climate change, and absolutely the fossil fuel industry has contributed to that. But it's not just the fossil fuel emissions. It's also the oil and gas, the exploration, the production, the pipeline construction that has really caused major damage to our coastal wetlands. The land that used to be the protective barriers that we were so used to, defending us from hurricanes and floods, it's now gone. The current trends hold, if it does, then New Orleans, we will truly be a coastal city within the next 50 years with no protective barriers. And even with Ida, we saw one of our coastal communities, Grand Isle, completely devastated. And it was, in fact, that barrier. And now is surviving, is really trying hard to come back. But it was imperative that the city take action to demand that these companies repair the damage they caused. And the lawsuit was truly about accountability, also, underscoring the damage that had occurred to our coast. And listen, the need to protect the city moving forward from future storms, from rising sea levels that are real. So this was not a political play. This was a demand for accountability because we have been damaged, and the future of our city really depends on us reinvesting and having those that damaged it reinvest in our coast so that we can protect ourselves for generations to come. Listen, it's predicted, again, 50 years from now, we have no protection, which is a problem. So that's where it really came from, accountability. And we have to do the best that we can to protect our people and protect this city and our culture.
So tell us about some of the other steps that the city is taking to address climate change. And let's get back to this issue of the electric grid. What steps is the city taking to ensure that you have a reliable and resilient system, and also that you're addressing carbon emissions?
Right. Well, we're doing I would say quite a bit, actually. And so on the front end of that is first having a plan, a climate action plan that has been fully adopted by my administration. And that plan truly does call, for the city to meet zero emissions in terms of our carbon footprint by 2050. So 50% by 2035, which we're in the midst of that right now. It's 2021. And so the plan is essential, but a plan is only as effective as its implementation. So pivoting very quickly to get some action. So on the front end of that has been our Solar for All campaign with our local solar industry, encouraging residents to install rooftop solar panels. I've since done that over the past, I guess it's been 4 years now. I've seen the benefit. In 2020 alone, we had over 450 new homes sign up, which is huge. And so we're seeing, and they are seeing, these homeowners are seeing savings of about $500 a year. So we're pushing, our folks to move in this direction. Even as it relates to home ownership, as we're moving more of our people into home ownership, we're making sure that they're green homes. So we're investing our resources into ensuring that these homes are energy efficient and are aligned with our climate action plan. Going further when I think about infrastructure in our fleet, which is a part of our infrastructure, we are currently designing a network of about 50 EV charging stations in the city right now to encourage electric vehicles just across the city. And of course, that starts with the accessibility. So we're making sure that happens. Also, I would say the utility scale solar, working to turn our vacant lots into large solar installations. And I would say one of the biggest is around our utility, the Sewage and Water Board. I kind of mentioned that on the front end, to where we are right now building a power a station, a new power station, because the one we have is inadequate, and it accounts right now for 35% of our emissions. So we're building a new power plant right now, and that will lessen the emissions and, of course, the burden on our city, and ties into our climate action plan. Microgrids are also, we're working to establish a series of them around the city, just for those community hubs. And let me tell you, this is what Ida taught us front and center. although we had activated our rec centers, many of them to be equipped with generators, we had to move into that once we lost power throughout the entire city. But now, as I think about moving forward, we're going to be even more swiftly in creating these microgrids with renewable energy, so that again, we can create these hubs in the event of a power outage, because it's not a matter of if, it's when, we will be hit. But of course, taking additional steps to improve our infrastructure, working with that utility. I'm looking for power lines to be underground, many other things that we're working towards.
Well, that is all great to hear, Mayor. So much action happening by you and your administration and those working throughout the city. But obviously, to really make a difference, we need a combination of local action, like you're doing, but also federal and state action. I'm curious to hear, if you were talking to decision makers both at the federal and state level, what requests would you have of them that you believe would help New Orleans in its efforts?
Sure. So, I had the fortunate opportunity to host President Biden not too long ago. And I made sure we hosted him at the Sewage and Water Board, at our utility. So we can demonstrate, one, the federal investments that we have made and that we are making, and showing him that we're primed for additional federal investments to our utilities, so that we can create that power grid, invest in our power grid in a way, on a larger scale, that leads to a solar farm. We pitched really not only an idea, but it's something that's gaining legs since that visit, even with Advisor McCarthy, about a large solar farm that could be placed on a former landfill that I have folks who've been living on there for over 50 years are saying, hey, relocate me. So I pitched that as being a win-win for us to provide environmental justice to our folks, getting them off of this former landfill, in addition to creating a solar farm on the site. So we pitched this. It does have legs, and we're moving towards it. Also, I kind of mentioned our water utility power infrastructure previously. So this includes, more efficient equipment and renewable energy to reduce that carbon footprint that I talked about, that it currently accounts for 35% of the carbon emissions. Also, our urban water plan with infrastructure, right, to slow and store and reuse water, and support streets and drainage infrastructure. So many of this, in terms of the infrastructure work on the ground, is happening. We just cut a ribbon on one of our green infrastructure projects that is a system utilizing green spaces, utilizing storm water management practices, bioswales, and the like, in an area that was prone to flooding, Gentilly, one of the neighborhoods that also had that green dot. But it will now hold millions of gallons of water. So we have multiple projects throughout the city that collectively will hold over 50 million gallons of water, plus. But this speaks to the leverage of both local, state, and federal assistance. So we're really hoping for an infrastructure bill that gets passed, because the city of New Orleans has the plans in place. We're working the plan, and all we need is a little bit more infusion of the cash to pull it off.
And in the private industry side of things, so today you're talking to a clean energy audience that is passionate about addressing climate change. So for those who are out there working in private industry, how can they be most helpful in fulfilling your vision for a carbon-free New Orleans?
Well, first of all, I love clean energy, the industry. Thank you so much for just proving that what you saw and what you were saying long time ago is indeed true, and it's factual. So the science matters. And so what I will say is, come to New Orleans, and we are a place to build and test your solutions. That's number one. And then also, we know right now we have one of the highest solar adaptation rates in the country, meaning the city of New Orleans. So we are being, innovative in areas like water management, battery development, and electric vehicles, and some of these things that I talked about. But I would say we're open, and we're right for it. And we want to be bold. That's my message to my folks on the ground here. We have to be bold about it and play to our geographical strengths in our city. And it's happening in our city. So I would say come and let's get to work here in the city of New Orleans.
Well, Mayor Cantrell, thank you so much for your leadership. It is amazing to see what you are doing. Really appreciated. And we do look forward to the day. Again, we're really sorry we're not there with you in person now, but really excited to bring tens of thousands of people from the clean energy industry in a future year to New Orleans. And between now and then, hopefully everyone gets this message of you're open for business. And so hopefully we'll see a lot of companies coming, using New Orleans, as you said, for a test bed, and helping continue that phenomenal progress that the city has made over the past 16 years since Hurricane Katrina. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to this next part of our general session. Allison Rayford, thank you so much for joining us. We just heard the conversation with Mayor Cantrell from New Orleans, where she talked about the urgency for action on climate change and the good results that actions have yielded in recent years. The companies that you represent, Google, and specifically Rayford, you're with X, which is the moonshot piece of Google, and Xcel Energy Colorado are at the top of the list of companies who are leading the push to accelerate our transition to carbon-free energy. So let's start by having you each briefly just introduce yourself and talk to us at a high level about what each of your companies are doing to help accelerate this transition. Alice, let's start with you.
Yeah, howdy everyone. Alice Jackson with Xcel Energy. I have the pleasure of serving as the president of Xcel Energy Colorado, and Julia is exactly right. We are really pressing on advancing and accelerating the clean energy transition in the utility sector. It started for us before 2018, but it became very public in 2018 when we were the very first utility in the country to announce a zero carbon system by 2050. And then recognizing the fact that people are going to want something and to see something a little tangible in advance of that, announced that we would hit at least an 80% carbon reduction by 2030 from our 2005 levels across all 8 of the states that we serve. And so this really kind of started that public transition and what is it that we're looking at. In Colorado, we're uniquely situated where we have an electric resource plan that we file every 4 years with our Public Utilities Commission. This is really the proof in the pudding for how we're making the advancements on our system. You started seeing some of those in 2018. There were a variety of headlines about the lowest cost renewables on the systems, namely wind and solar. We've advanced those, and we anticipate being at least at 55% renewables by 2025. But it doesn't stop there. With the announcement at the tail end of 2018, we then moved into what's the next iteration. And we're currently in the process of looking at how can we move forward even faster in the state of Colorado. We're in the midst of another electric resource plan here, and that plan is going to take us to at least an 85% carbon reduction by 2030, as well as we expect approximately 80% of the kilowatt hours that our customers consume at that point in time will come from a renewable resource. This is really driving carbon out of the system. But I think, Julia, as we all know, it's not just about the electric system, it's also about the other systems around it. So transportation becomes part of the conversation, and electrification, particularly of looking at light duty vehicles. And we've made an announcement around that as well, as we're striving to help our customers lower the barrier to entry, whether they're residential, their fleets, busing for the communities and the schools. And so we're looking at adding roughly 1.5 million electric vehicles across the Xcel Energy system by 2030 as well. So putting systems in place to enable that to happen, especially focusing on low and moderate income families, those that live in multi-housing facilities, those are all pieces of the puzzle that we have to consider. So we've started there, and we're definitely not finished. We continue to look at the advancement of technology, which is another piece of the puzzle. Announcements of getting to 80%, by 2030 means you still have 20% to go. And that also recognizes, we can use existing technology today within the boundaries of affordability and reliability, but we need technological advancement in order to close that remaining gap. So I look forward to the conversation with you and Rayford here today, because I know we're going to dig into a variety of these things, but that kind of gives you a high-level overview of where we stand today and where we're pressing.
Great. Rayford.
Great, thank you, Julia and Alice. Appreciate the easy setup. So far, Google. I led the energy team at Google prior to joining X. We've been focused on trying to green our operations for quite some time. Since 2007, we've been carbon neutral, and since really 2017, we've been 100% renewable on an annual global basis. But that really wasn't enough for us. And so we announced the 24/7 Carbon-Free Energy Initiative, where we want to be every hour of every day, everywhere, 100% carbon-free. That really, to get there, though, is going to be quite some task. We want to do that by 2030. So we don't have a lot of time. There are 4 major aspects on how to improve that strategy. The first one is around data and analytics. How do we use the data and the intelligence that we can build into the systems to use energy more wisely and to predict where prices and energy markets are going. Secondarily, how do we think about technology, the hardware, the physical aspects of the system, and how do we, as Alice was just saying, how do we start to look at new technologies that are coming? Where do we place our bets? What should we really be doing for our infrastructure? Third, regulatory and policy. How do we make sure that markets are functioning right and that policies are supportive of these sorts of technologies, capabilities? And then last but not least, how we purchase and buy energy and use energy on a day-to-day basis. And then when I was leading that team, I got so enamored with some of the aspects of that, I actually changed from that team to this team. And now I'm leading the technology and product functions over here in X, focusing strictly around the grid, because we can build out a lot of new generation technologies, or we might be able to change the efficiency of how energy is consumed at the end point. But without a stronger, more resilient grid that can do a lot more than what it can do today, we're still not going to be able to easily hit those targets. And so what we're focused on now is how do we enable the grid to be a lot smarter and a lot more resilient, a lot more economic, equitable, and of course, sustainable at the same time. So with that, that's where we are. And I look forward to having a really interesting conversation about how these technologies are advancing.
Great. Thank you so much both for sort of level setting everyone with the high level things that your company are both working on today, but also striving to achieve. Alice, I want to come back to you and just sort of lay the cards on the table and say, we often hear people, media, others say that utilities that have goals to get to carbon free are just greenwashing. How do you respond to that?
Well, not all kilowatt hours delivered to customers are created equal. But at the same time, what I would say, Julia, is the proof is really in the pudding. And you heard me talk about in that introduction how it's not just about acquiring resources that come in at various times a day, or even resources that are off of our system. We are literally on the system here in Colorado going to be delivering 80% of the energy in 2030 from a renewable resource. And so that really does make a difference. I think you can look at it even more closely in Colorado specifically of how we're interconnected from a transmission perspective. We don't have ample resources to be able to import from other areas, which also means we don't have ample opportunities to export as well at this point in time. And so that really does mean we have a system where you have to look at a microcosm of how do you provide all of the components of the physics to maintain the reliability of the system. And so you have to be able to deliver those resources to customers. The other thing, though, that I would point to, Julia, is this really is going to be, it has to be a symbiotic relationship between utilities and their customers as we move forward. There's going to have to be interaction between us. That clearly shows when are the low carbon times of day that you're going to be able to consume energy, maybe to charge that electric vehicle, run your dishwasher or dryer, those kinds of things, versus other times when it's not only going to be more expensive potentially, but also have a higher content in carbon because the wind and the solar or some other type of renewable resource or even battery storage has been depleted. So those are the kinds of things we have to continue to work with our customers on, is really doing deeper education, but then at the same time, making it easy. And that's where we rely on people like Rayford to help us figure out how are we going to do that, to really train, not necessarily train, but how to communicate clearly with our customers and enable those systems so that the technology works. And we can, number one, maintain the reliability of the system, but two, really maintain the affordability as well.
Yeah, and so on that note, Rayford, but before going over to Google and now X, you spent more than 25 years of your career working in the utility industry, primarily at utilities across the southeastern part of the country. So I'd be curious to hear from your vantage point, are utilities serious about reducing carbon emissions? And then what role can Google and others play in helping utilities to be successful in that effort?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think one thing when we always would get asked when I was in the utility about like, what are your priorities? We'd always say kind of the same three things, right? We want safe, affordable, and reliable service. It's not that different. Actually, being over here at Google, we always talked about first and foremost, we need to have resiliency. We need to have a grid that works, that delivered power, because without that, the products and services and the things that at least we do can't be done. And then beyond that, we needed something that was economic. We have the ability to basically use resources, but also locate them almost anywhere in the world. And we need those resources to be competitive for them from an economic standpoint too. But we need them to be sustainable. But getting there, as I mentioned earlier, is quite a challenge. Some places you have an abundance of resources and other places you don't. And where you don't, you need transmission or you need other capabilities to be able to move those resources to where they're needed. To me, this is why we're focusing so much on the grid itself, because it's almost like unless you're blessed with all those capabilities right there in your backyard, you have to have some sort of way of moving things around to make sure not only can you get access to the right resources, but that frankly, you can have a reliable system. And I think we've gotten so used to, as a society, how easy it is to just flip the light switch and make the power come on, that we've kind of lost that there's a whole lot of complexity inside that system to really make it work. And really, that's what we're focusing on right now, is that complexity. How do we make it operate even better? How do we provide those insights? For example, it's no longer enough to just look and forecast what a price is going to look like. You also have to forecast the carbon content behind it. And those sorts of things, when you start thinking about how do I predict what I should be doing, it's no longer a one or two dimensional problem. Now it's a multi-dimensional problem. And it requires the whole system to work together. And it's overcoming those silos of the different parts and pieces. That's, a big part of the challenge to make it work collectively.
And I have to jump in here. I couldn't agree with you more, Rayford, on where things are going, because I think really it's important for people to understand not every utility is created equal when it comes to availability of wind and solar. For example, in Colorado, we enjoy roughly 300 days of sunshine a year. We have the Great Wind Express that comes through the eastern part of our state. So that means I have great access to wind and solar here in order to match up a lot of resources for my customers. But if you go farther east or even farther to the southwest, you start losing some of the ability and the facility in order to be able to deliver, say, wind resources in the southwest, solar in the north. It doesn't become as economic or as available for customers. So figuring out the transmission interconnection to be able to move that energy different places. And even in Colorado, there's significant benefit in looking at, okay, does that solar in the desert southwest that's time differentiated help with the resources or the needs in Colorado for my customers? So there's a lot of opportunity here to look at the grid and how do we help each other. It can't just be looking at the borders of our own states or even the borders of our own utilities. But the other thing that I want to reinforce that you were talking about is really about that carbon content. The focus is how do we drive a lower emissions type generation resource, and whether that's carbon or other GHGs, you got to focus on it. And in order to turn something off in one resource area, in order to take advantage of, say, an economic benefit for another resource, you have to look at the carbon content or the GHG content of that other resource. And right now, markets don't typically track and provide that information on a detailed basis. And so we have to look for opportunities to not only increase and do inside of the utility what we need to do to transition, we also have to work with our market partners in order to drive some of those transitions in the reporting so that we can all track it and look at it. Because every state is now starting to come up with different metrics on what we have to meet. And in order for us as utilities to cross state boundaries on generation resources, we're going to have to be able to see that information. So there's another layer of complexity, right? And you're exactly right. There are a number of them, but this is something that we're all looking at and figuring out, how do we continue to move these forward?
So, gosh, so you've already mentioned a number of challenges. We've got transmission planning, we've got market rules and incentives. What are some of the other things that each of you see as the biggest challenges that your companies face in achieving your carbon reduction goals? Rayford, do you want to go first?
Sure, no worries. Well, so there's one great advantage about working at a place like Google is that technology never seems to be the barrier to many of the things that we do, right? We can always go find some smart software engineers and create something. The downside, though, is that Moore's law, right, which is basically that costs will decline rapidly over time for silicon-based products, means that everyone here knows it. And so when they look at the cost curves associated with solar or battery storage, they apply Moore's laws to it. And to their credit, they have been correct that those prices will continue to come down, though it becomes a challenging conversation when you're trying to justify doing a deal in a particular area and they feel like your price forecast needs to be lower. But the whole idea is that when we look at some of these things, we were saying, we have operations all over the world, but in some places we have the geography that goes 180 degrees opposite of what we need to support this sort of environment. And even then, sometimes transmission won't solve that problem. Imagine an island, for example, or being at the very tip of a peninsula in a solitary state, right? It makes it very tough in some circumstances to do it. Market rules and regulations can also be problems too, where they inhibit or they artificially drive up prices. Part of our challenge here isn't just around the technology, it's around kind of making that whole ecosystem work together to try and do this. The key fundamental, though, to really make it work is collaboration. To me, the only way for all of us to get there is for all of us to be working towards the problem. And so we're not looking for a Google solution. We're not looking for a tech solution. We're not looking for an American solution. We're looking for a global solution where all of our companies can work together and share in these benefits. And to me, that I think is the critical aspect to overcoming all these challenges, is we have to do it together.
Yeah, and I can't, disagree with that at all. In fact, the way that we started our transition significantly, wasn't just in 2018, which was what I mentioned, but in 2004, when our communities here in Colorado started talking about how this was what was important to them. Historically, customers, when you survey them and you ask them what is important, what are the things that you want us to track, and what are the metrics? First off, reliability is at the top of the list, right? That's always going to be. It hasn't changed. That's where it is. But number 2 and number 3 have kind of switched back and forth depending upon who you're talking to and what state you're in. And 2 and 3 are inevitably affordability and sustainability. And so some places sustainability may come in more, and where people are saying, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for the energy that I'm consuming because I recognize the benefits that I gain in having renewable resources or a zero carbon resource on the system. And so they look at that and they say, okay, how do we get that done? In Colorado, our customers were a little bit more advanced than some other states and started saying earlier they wanted to see those resources on the system. To Rayford's point, when we bought those resources back in 2006 and 2007 for wind specifically, that was at 6.9 cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas in 2018, in the resource plan that I was mentioning before, those were 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour on average. And so you can really see how that price curve can come down. At the same time, I would also argue is that but for the purchases that were done earlier to incentivize the companies to continue innovating and driving more efficiencies into their product, you wouldn't have gotten to the lower costing resources. So I think it's a really interesting conversation today, Julia, because I think a number of people sit there and go, okay, the generation resources are less expensive today. Why don't we just replace the entire system? And what they forget is that we've made a mortgage, kind of agreement with somebody 15 years ago that says, I'm going to pay 6.9 cents per kilowatt hour for wind because it enabled the resources that we're getting today. And you can't just wipe that mortgage out. You could buy it out, but you can't just magically snap your fingers and wipe it out. So the idea of completely resetting the generation base in the country isn't one that's physically possible right now, but it's also not financially possible because of the commitments that have been made, whether to utilities or third parties who have developed these resources over the past several years. The last thing I'll touch on, and I'd love Rayford to get into a little bit of a conversation on this with you, is really around when we look at the time frame between now and 2030, the types of resources we have on the system. So I've mentioned that in Colorado, with the blessings that we have, the resources that we're putting together, we're going to hit 80% renewables on the system. We're going to be 85% carbon reduction from our 2005 levels. But we still have reliability needs of the system that make us continue to use some fossil-based generation, like natural gas, namely. Now we're looking at hydrogen blends, ammonia blends, other pieces of the puzzle that can come in. But those resources, what I think is really interesting when you look at them, they're only being used less than 10% of the time. So the capacity factors on those resources are incredibly low. And that's where we continue to need the technological advancement, is to figure out how do we move, those types of resources off the system in the long-term future. But in the near term, we're still going to need it to meet the needs. And I'd love to know, Rayford, if you have some additional technologies that we should be looking at, because that's a piece of the puzzle for us to go forward with too, is figuring out how do we drive those last bits, that last 15% or so is really hard.
Yeah, I agree. It sounds perhaps trite, but it's really the last 15% that really matters the most. It does the most to drive the cost and change really how the system works. And here we're also looking at a lot of the same technologies, and we're placing some strategic bets as to which ones we think will pay off. But as I mentioned, the area that we're trying to focus in most is really around the grid, because as we see it, we think about things like synthetic inertia. How do you get something that normally where you have all this rotating mass from a fossil unit? How do you create the same thing, but now on an inverter-based power electronics basis? How do you make the grid kind of work interoperably with customer assets, utility assets, third-party assets to all collaborate to solve these problems? Really, those are some of the most fascinating areas I think we're working on, and some of the areas that Alice, I think, would love to see come to Colorado, but love to see at Xcel Energy and elsewhere. I think have some really amazing opportunities. And I know our companies have collaborated well in the past, and I look forward to doing even more.
So Rayford, on that point of really figuring out how all of these different resources, technologies at different scales can play together nicely on the grid, I am curious to hear your perspectives on what do you think the future is going to look like in terms of the mix of large scale clean energy resources and distributed generation? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. To be honest, the way the grid is designed and operated today, it's kind of a cookie cutter, right? Everybody gets kind of the same service, the same reliability, the same capabilities. And it's through no fault of its own, right? It's just the way it's been designed and was rational and reasonable to do it that way. But now when we start thinking about the mix between all these resources and what some customers maybe can afford and what others may want, what I see is that we now have the ability, through the advanced technologies that I was describing, to start to customize the service. So the customers are more in control of the level of reliability and the economics of their transaction and the sustainability of the transaction. Frankly, I think that's the empowering part of where the technology is going. It lets them pick and choose the mix of things that are most relevant and needing to them. And frankly, I look forward to seeing that. I think that will make customers feel a lot more empowered, but it will also, I think, create more efficient outcomes than perhaps the cookie cutter approach that we've had to do up until now.
And Alice, I'm curious to get your reaction not only to this question about large, the role of large scale generation and distributed energy, but also, to what Rayford was just saying about giving customers more choice, right? Utilities have always, to some degree, been able to give their customers choice, but how, as a utility, do you have to operate differently in order to take that to the next level?
No, I think it's a great question. And, to some extent, we have offered, to our customers a lot of different options. Whether it's energy efficiency and demand side management activities where you can choose to interrupt, say, in a high costing time frame or in a reliability situation where you can help the system, all the way to how do you pick different facilities and appliances in your home in order to be able to interact with the grid. I think, Google has the Nest thermostat. That has been a game changer in some of the interactions with customers. But then when you talk about, quality of service, or say, for instance, there's certain manufacturers that have much more sensitive loads and momentary outages, which most of us would be like, okay, I got to reset my clocks. They have a much larger impact from those types of things. And so how do you help those types of customers have a higher reliability that they're willing to, quite frankly, pay for because it saves them money to do so? And that's where we're getting more sophisticated and working specifically with customers. It's much more than an automatic throw over these days. It's putting battery and storage systems in that work on both the grid and the customer side to make sure that you're meeting the needs of that particular individual in order for them to be able to do their business. Now, I will say is, between the different types of resources, when you talk about distributed generation versus centralized, utility scale, there are some differences, but there's places for all of it. Customers absolutely can put on the rooftop solar or participate in community solar garden or other opportunities those ways. But I think what we have to continuously look at too is that affordability side of the equation too. For example, customers on our system in Colorado that have rooftop solar, they're paid roughly 14 cents per kilowatt hour. 12 cents per kilowatt hour for the rooftop solar. But then we're buying the large scale solar at less than 2.5. And so there's a difference in cost for customers from that perspective on how does it work. But the other thing that I'd like, for us to start focusing on more is it used to be you just paid kilowatt hour per kilowatt hour. When we're talking about transitioning a system and driving carbon out of the system, the orientation of those solar panels may not be to optimize overall production of kilowatt hours, but should be optimizing when they're producing in order to drive more carbon out of the system. So that goes back to that communication and collaboration that we were talking about previously, is how do you set the right expectations? How do you incentivize customers when they participate and they make personal generation or battery storage choices? Is how do you help them optimize around when it's going to do and provide the best outcome for the system as a whole? And so those are things that we have to continuously work through and look at. The other piece of the puzzle is how is the affordability going to impact all of our types of customers, whether they're the low income, the high income, or somebody in between. And that's a big conversation that's ongoing right now.
So Alice, your point about, potentially the direction in which panels face may be different than what historically or sort of the natural inclination might be. That raises a question for me that I'd love to hear your thoughts on in terms of, for the audience listening to this today, right? Many of them are in the renewable energy space. They're installers, they're project developers, they're financing systems. What things do you think collectively the clean energy industry and the utility industry need to be working more closely on in the coming, let's say, 2 to 5 years in order to ensure that we continue to see, really, again, this whole conversation is around accelerating the transition. So what are the top of mind things that would really, in your mind, help accelerate if there were better collaboration or increased communication on?
Well, I can tell you one thing. We have an idea of how the transition is going to come together. We kind of have the big blocks and pieces for the blocking and tackling. But at the end of the day, somewhere we're going to be wrong. And so figuring out how to put some flexibility into the way that we're interacting and what we're communicating on and contracting around, quite frankly. For example, we have a number of solar facilities that are being currently built in the state of Colorado that have battery storage associated with them. But with the investment tax credit, you can't dispatch that battery storage for the optimal utilization on the system. You have to dispatch that battery storage so that it's solely charged from the solar. And that's a great cost benefit, not only to customers, but also to the developer. But at the same time, it limits the flexibility that you have to actually use it on the system in the best way possible. And so things like that is like, once we get past year 6, how do you then optimize around using that storage to manage the system? But it's one example that's really tangible about how there's some unexpected and unintended consequences of whether it's tax law or it's something that you figure out physically on the system. one of the things we have to recognize is our electrical systems are dynamic. I've yet to have a single customer call me and say, hey, Ms. Jackson, I'm about to turn the light switch on. That's not the way it works. And we have to manage that dynamically on our side so that our customers don't have to make those phone calls, regardless of what their size is. So as we move forward through time and we're adding more variability and more uncertainty into the system, how then do we either program around removing some of that variability and uncertainty? How do we look at the technologies to be able to layer things in together? How's there something closer to the customer maybe that compensates for a shift in the system that's larger because we don't have, to Rayford's point earlier, the spinning mass on the system? And those are the problems and those are the opportunities, quite frankly, that we really have to dig into some of the technology and the details in order to make all of this work. Because just like California, we've all heard about the duck curve. I don't think anybody on day one was sitting there saying, here comes the duck curve, let's get ready for it and program around it. And then when it got there, they're going, okay, now it's changing and it's moving and it's doing different things. It's going to continue to be dynamic for us as we continue to develop the technologies, we develop the resources, we improve them, as our customers change their preferences, as they adopt, different activities, and as we communicate with them better. And that's why we have to come at this from multiple directions. It's not just a problem for the utilities to solve. It's a problem that we have to collaborate on with our customers, with our regulators, with third parties and developers to really put out there. And Julia, I know you've heard me say this time and again, the problem statements. My job is not to research and develop new technology. My job as a utility is to keep the lights on, to make sure it's affordable for my customers, and that I'm providing an increasingly clean system. And so for me, that means where the gaps are, I've got to put those problem statements out there so that companies like X can go and figure out what's the technology to close the gap, so that SEPA can help us go and figure out what is it that we need to concentrate on, what do we need to press on, because it's an issue for multiple utilities versus an issue for one. Because all of us are going to have those problem statements, and inevitably something's going to go a way we didn't expect it to, and we're going to have to be flexible to figure out how to move forward and then get to success overall.
Rayford, on this point of collaboration, what do you, anything in particular that Alice said resonate with you, or additional thoughts in the next 2 to 5 years? Where are the places in most need of collaboration across the whole sector?
Well, yeah, first off, just the general emphasis on collaboration. I mean, so much of what I see, not just here in the energy industry, but also just generally in the political environment today, collaboration is the only way, I think, to move things forward, right? We all have to collectively work towards solving problems as opposed to thinking we can do it all ourselves. That being said, one thing Alice said that really resonated with me was the need for flexibility. I used to run integrated resource planning, and, we would look at these present value of revenue requirements to say, like, okay, what's the minimal cost system and, to meet our requirements. But it never did we ask, like, what's the most flexible system? Right. And I think that, along with the carbon content conversation we were having at the very beginning of our conversation here, was these are new ways to look at the same problem, but they're really important lenses I think we have to apply to be able to figure out how to design and operate the system going forward. Right. Without that level of flexibility, without that sort of forward-looking thinking about carbon content, really hard to make progress. It's almost about how do we shine a light on the problem areas, to Alice's point about what are the problem statements? How do we shine a light on that and really get the best of what we can each do to solve those problems? And like I said, the only way to do that is for all of us to work together and start to have those conversations and start to try those things.
And Alice, you mentioned earlier tax policy as an example of an area where we may need to be working more closely together to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences down the road. What other, I'd like to sort of switch to that policy perspective and hear from each of you about, what do you think is most needed from policymakers, both at the federal and the state level?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Julia. And, one thing that I've been, really contemplating a lot lately is the standard of review. So right now, I would argue that the standard of review for utilities operations is 100%. So in other words, we have to be perfect on reliability. I mean, think about it. Most of our customers, if they have a momentary outage or they have even one that's 5, 10 minutes, not mentioning the longer ones that are an hour or longer, they're disappointed. The expectation and the level of measurement is 100%. And so as we move forward through the process and we evaluate operational excellence, what is that measure of, performance? Where are we going to have the conversation of, okay, now we have more variable resources on the system where you don't have a button, a dial, a phone to call somebody to say, hey, turn up production or turn down production, because you're dependent on external factors to make them work. So, that's one of the things when I think about policymakers and what we need to do, what's that level of expectation? The other one is I've talked about it before, is that in large part, we are rebuilding a plane that's already in flight. And so figuring out, it goes back to some of the flexibility. It goes back to what does this look like? It goes back to redefining even what some of the boundaries of what a utility is in the process of how do we make this work? If we're going to have a symbiotic relationship with the customers in communications, well, where does that go with what's the metric for the communications? How far does it go into a customer's residence, business, home, office space in order to make the system work as a whole? How do the customers feel about that? I mean, obviously, with some of the technologies they're adopting, they're much more comfortable with welcoming some of those technologies into their home and having some of that control be turned over to make life easy. And so these are questions I think regulators are going to have to deal with. I think the other thing that we're going to have to deal with, Julia, is speed. The technology is coming and we have to figure out how do we test it on the system, get comfortable with it for everything from a security perspective all the way to an operational perspective. And if it's going to take us a year plus for every single idea that comes forward in order to implement it, that's going to be a real problem. Because Rayford's company and others don't want to wait. They can't afford to wait that time frame in order for things to be adopted. But we're also going to have to understand, this is the last thing, and then I'll let Rayford jump in, is we have to recognize we're going to try some things that aren't going to work. And a lot of times, whether it's a feeling, I honestly believe it's in actuality, who gets shot when it doesn't work is a real question. But if we're going to truly make the change and we're going to adopt a different environment, we're going to have to try some things that we're not as familiar with or even as comfortable. And so therefore, you're going to have to take some risk. And some of that risk should be borne by the customers that are depending on us to make the transition. And so that's the question, is how are we going to have that conversation? Where are we? What's a reasonable risk for each side to take in order to make the transition? Because if there isn't a good balance there, then it's going to slow down the transition and inhibit it versus enable it and move it forward.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more that to me, the biggest barriers that I think need to be addressed is how do we get to speed? When I worked at the utility, I understood the rationale and the dynamic for wanting to be cautious because you had people's lives at risk, right? You had to make sure the system operated and you wanted to make sure that you knew that when you were going to put something in, that it would work. And it would work reliably. But now that the system is becoming less analog, less mechanical, and now very digital system, you're talking about the ability to iterate much faster is there. And so as we think about that, we're not just talking about a technology problem. We're talking about a workflow process problem, change management problem, heck, even a regulatory problem in the sense that I used to ask audiences, how fast does it take a utility to update its pricing, its tariffs, right? Months, years, whatever, right? How long does it take for an intelligent electric device that's been encoded with some sort of software algorithm to update its algorithm to optimize? Seconds, right? I used to work at Enron, and I would say that's what we would call an arbitrage moment. Right? Which is to say, when you can move faster than the price itself can change, you're creating an inefficiency in the market. And to me, as we add the technologies, we need to add the capabilities to allow for speed and flexibility, lest we create some of these unintended consequences, lest we create a market that doesn't necessarily function right. We want to make sure that everything is moving as fast as possible, but we also want to have that comfort in the resiliency and the capability of the grid to do what it needs to do. And it means that both sides are going to be super uncomfortable for a while as we try and navigate these waters and transition from where we were and how we did it to now where we need to be.
So as a final question, we're running out of time here. I want to ask each of you, how do you respond to naysayers who say that, your company's goals to get to carbon free either aren't necessary or in fact potentially even not possible? Rayford, let's go to you first.
Sure. Well, I live in the Deep South, and we have hurricanes. I mean, we saw Hurricane Ida just a few weeks ago. They are incredibly devastating. And I am out in California all the time. There are wildfires going on out there. I spent a lot of time in Australia, similar problems. I mean, we see these problems all over the world. I don't know that there's a greater imperative for our generation right now than to address this problem. It's also not an easy problem. If it were easy, we would have already had the solution. We would have already done it and it would be solved. So for us, we have to overcome it. But just because there are a few challenges in our way doesn't mean we shouldn't be making forward progress. To me, it's the pain of the problem is greater than the cost of the solution. Like, we need to keep moving forward. We'll find solutions to cost. We'll find solutions to resiliency. We'll find them for equity. I don't know them all necessarily right now, but the key thing is forward progress and keep moving.
Yeah, I can't agree more with the forward progress piece. I think we have to keep taking those steps. And sometimes those steps are going to be baby steps, and sometimes they're going to be great leaps as we move forward and we figure out different pieces of the puzzle. But I think just like Rayford was mentioning, some of the examples in the Southeast, in Colorado too, we had our largest wildfires last year ever on record. This year, we had some of the worst air pollution in the world because of the inversion we enjoy along the Front Range and the smoke that was coming from the fires that are in California, Oregon, and the West Coast. But I think you also look at the electrical system. Look at Winter Storm Uri in February and how the center of the U.S. was impacted dramatically when the winter storm came all the way down, and we had snow on Galveston Island on the Gulf Coast. And we had, from gas interruptions to freeze-offs, but then also look at last summer and on the West Coast, the broad high heat over a large swath of the territory then caused rolling outages in some states. Look at what happened in this summer. And once again, the high heat in the Pacific Northwest. Our environment around us is changing, and it's obvious that the systems that we have that have worked really well in the past are starting to need to be addressed to look at what the variability is that we are facing now. And that is exactly what we have to be doing. And we have to build that flexibility we were talking about before. We have to build that flexibility into the system to not only address what it is that we know for the past 30 years, as far as weather patterns and size of storms, frequency, and those kinds of impacts. We also have to recognize that it's going to be different going forward and it's going to change. So how do we build to give some of that hardening? How do we build so that we don't interrupt human life? Because at the end of the day, the energy systems that we are responsible for are life sustaining. They're required in order to be able to go about do what it is that we do. They support in our underpinnings to our economy. So it's important for us to look at the flexibility of those systems, to continue to plan and look at the operability and where it is that not only we can maintain our own systems, but where we can support each other. I think one fine point on this, Julia, is in the West. When you look at resource adequacy, it is not simply about one state, one system. It is about the broader impact. We saw that again in Winter Storm Uri in the Central. It is not just about one system. It is about the broader impact across multiple of them. And I think that's something that we have to continue to be sensitive to and look at, is figuring out, number one, how do we maintain that number one thing that customers look for, which is reliability on the system. I think the rest of what Rayford said about we can manage around the affordability. We need to be looking at these things. Absolutely. We have to be cost conscious 100% of the time and bringing those things in. But at the end of the day, if the lights aren't on and the gas isn't in the pipes, customers can't go about doing their day-to-day lives and work and then continue to survive and thrive.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you both so much for joining us, but more importantly, I want to thank you for the leadership that you and your companies are taking to ensure that we really are not just putting out these big goals, but in fact accelerating the transition.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.